choose differently, that someone actually valued her enough to offer her a choice rather than simply transferring her from one form of ownership to another. Her hands moved slowly, clumsily, forming signs she had learned in their dawn meetings in the library, in that bright room in Bermondsey, asking the question that had haunted her since she wrote that terrible letter of surrender. "Why would you want someone so broken?" she signed. "Someone so thoroughly damaged by years of silence and submission. Someone who cannot even speak without permission. Someone who has proven herself a coward." Frederick's expression softened, and he signed back with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "You are not broken," he signed. "You are bound. There is a difference. Broken things cannot be repaired, but bound things can be freed. You have spent your entire life in chains, but the chains are not part of you. They are imposed from outside. And I am asking, will you unbind yourself? Will you choose freedom even though it is terrifying? Will you choose a future that you build rather than one that is built for you? Will you choose me? Not because you have to, not because you owe me, not because you have no other option, but because you want to, because you believe you deserve happiness, because you are brave enough to reach for something better than what you have been told to accept." Emmeline looked into his grey eyes and saw something she had never seen in any man's gaze before. She saw respect, admiration, desire that had nothing to do with her dowry or her family name, or her usefulness as a social ornament. She saw someone who had looked at her genuine self, messy and emotional and intellectual and inappropriate as it was, and decided that she was worth fighting for, worth kneeling before, worth offering a choice when he could have simply struck a bargain with her mother and treated her as property to be transferred. She glanced at her mother, sitting rigid and furious in her chair, and she thought about all the years of training, all the slaps and corrections and endless lessons in silence and submission, all the ways she had been shaped to fit into a mold that was too small for human souls. And she thought about the conservatory where she had watched Edmund kiss Lydia, about the engagement party where she had smiled through tears while he announced their wedding date, about his crude whispers and violent hands and the future that had stretched before her like a prison sentence. Then she thought about the library mornings, about learning to sign, about Frederick's hand on her throat feeling her laughter, about the bright room in Bermondsey where deaf children played without shame, and she had screamed her first real scream, about Beatrice stamping her feet in approval and signing that freedom was a choice that must be made every day. And she understood that this moment was one of those choices, perhaps the most important one she would ever make, the choice between the familiar cage and the terrifying openness of liberation. Her hands moved slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, forming the signs Frederick had taught her, spelling out words that felt like revolution. "Yes," she signed, "I choose freedom. I choose you. I choose a future that I build rather than one that is built for me. I am terrified, and I do not know if I am strong enough, but I want to try. I want to be brave enough to reach for something better. I want to unbind myself, even if I do not yet know who I will be without the chains. Will you help me? Will you be patient with me while I learn to be free?" Frederick's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her down to kneel with him on the floor, his arms wrapping around her as she collapsed against his chest, her body shaking with sobs that were no longer silent, sounds pouring from her throat without restraint or apology, loud, messy grief and relief and terror and hope all mixed together. And he held her while she cried, his hand on her back feeling the vibrations of her voice. And he was smiling, actually smiling while she wept, because he understood that this was not breakdown, but breakthrough, not weakness, but the first real expression of strength she had ever allowed herself. Lady Catherine stood abruptly, her face white with rage. "This is unseemly," she began, but the Duke of Brandon cut her off with a gesture. "Sit down, Lady Catherine," he said coldly. "You have no authority here any more. The Duke of Wentworth has made his offer and Lady Emmeline has accepted. The banns will be posted tomorrow. The wedding will take place as soon as legally possible, and you will attend with a pleasant expression and congratulations for your daughter, or you will not attend at all. Those are your only choices. I suggest you choose wisely." Mrs. Morland approached the kneeling couple, and when Emmeline looked up with tear-stained face, Beatrice signed with a smile. "Welcome to the world of the living. You have chosen freedom. Now comes the hard part, learning to live it every day. But you will not be alone. We will help you. The deaf community will embrace you, and your Duke will protect you. You have made the right choice, the brave choice, the choice that will save your life." Emmeline signed back shakily. "I am still afraid. I do not know how to be free. I have spent my whole life learning to be silent and obedient. I do not know who I am without those things." Beatrice signed. "That is the adventure, discovering who you are when you are not performing for someone else, when you are not shrinking yourself to fit into spaces too small. It will take time. There will be days when you want to return to the cage, because it is familiar and freedom is exhausting. But freedom is also beautiful, is also worth the difficulty, is also the only thing that makes life worth living. And you have already taken the first step. You have chosen. Everything else follows from that choice." Frederick helped Emmeline to her feet, supporting her as she swayed slightly, still affected by the laudanum and overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. And he signed, "We should go. I want to take you away from this house, away from your mother. I have prepared rooms for you at my residence with Mrs. Morland as chaperone to preserve all propriety. You can rest there, recover from the drugs your mother has been giving you, and when you are ready, we can plan our wedding. Or not. We can simply exist together for a while, learning to communicate, learning to be free. Whatever you need, I will provide." Emmeline nodded, and then, with effort, she turned to face her mother. This woman who had shaped and controlled her entire life, who had taught her that silence was survival and expression was danger, who had drugged her and locked her away and tried to sell her to a violent man to cover family debts. And she opened her mouth and spoke, her voice rough from disuse and medication, but present, real, audible. "I am leaving," she said, the words feeling strange in her throat after so many years of learned silence. "I am marrying the Duke of Wentworth, and I am never coming back to this house. You will have your debts paid, you will keep your position in society, but you will no longer have any control over me. I am done being your possession, your solution, your sacrifice. I am claiming my own life, and you cannot stop me." Lady Catherine's face twisted with fury and something that might have been grief, but she said nothing, merely turned away as though she could dismiss this rebellion by refusing to acknowledge it. And Emmeline felt a strange liberation in that turning away, understood that her mother's opinion, her mother's approval, her mother's love had never been available anyway, had always been conditional on perfect obedience and complete self-suppression, and she was finally choosing to stop trying to earn something that was never going to be given. Frederick guided her toward the door, Mrs. Morland and the Duke of Brandon following, and as they left the drawing-room, as they walked through the entrance hall where she had spent 26 years learning to make herself small and silent and invisible, Emmeline felt something shifting inside her chest, some heavy weight beginning to lift, some locked door beginning to open, and though she was still frightened, still uncertain, still struggling to believe that this was real and not just another laudanum dream that would dissolve when she woke, she also felt for the first time in her life the faint stirring of hope, the possibility that there might be another way to exist in the world, and that possibility alone was worth every risk, every consequence, every terrifying step into the unknown. Emmeline stood in the drawing room with Frederick still kneeling before her, his grey eyes full of hope and tenderness and patient waiting. With Mrs. Morland and the Duke of Brandon watching with expressions of approval and anticipation. With her mother rigid and furious in her chair, with Clara the maid hovering near the doorway with tears streaming down her face, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. This choice that would determine the entire course of her future, this decision that could not be unmade once spoken, and she realized with sudden clarity that she could not simply accept Frederick's proposal, could not merely transfer herself from one man's protection to another's, could not truly choose freedom until she had first broken the chains herself, had first destroyed the symbols of her captivity, had first claimed her voice in a way that was undeniable and irrevocable. "I need time," she signed to Frederick, her hands still shaking but her movements deliberate. "I need 1 hour alone to think, to write, to understand what I am choosing. Will you wait for me? Will you trust me to return?" Frederick's face showed surprise but no disappointment, and he signed back immediately. "Take all the time you need. I will wait here, or I will wait 1,000 years if necessary. This is your choice, and it must be made in your own time, in your own way. I trust you completely." Emmeline nodded and turned toward the door, ignoring her mother's sharp demand to know where she thought she was going, ignoring the Duke of Brandon's questioning look, walking past Clara, who stepped aside to let her pass, and she moved through the familiar hallways of the house with a strange sense of seeing them for the first time, or perhaps for the last time, understanding that whatever happened in the next hour, she would never be the same person who had walked these halls in silent submission for 26 years. The library door opened under her hand with the familiar creak she had heard 1,000 mornings. But today the sound seemed different, seemed to mark a threshold between her old life and whatever came next. And she entered the room that had been her only sanctuary, the place where she had first met Frederick, where she had first learned that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, where she had first glimpsed the possibility of another way to exist. She went directly to the writing desk and pulled out a fresh journal, the leather binding soft and unmarked, pages blank and waiting, and she picked up her pen with hands that trembled with something between terror and exhilaration, and she began to write. Everything she had never said, everything she had swallowed and suppressed and hidden away in the deepest parts of herself, poured out onto the pages in a flood of words that felt like blood leaving a wound, like poison being purged from a body, like truth that had been locked away for so long that releasing it felt like violence. She wrote about her father's funeral, about being 8 years old and grief-stricken and slapped for crying too loudly, about learning that her pain was less important than other people's comfort, about discovering that silence was survival and sound was danger. She wrote about every insult her mother had delivered in the name of improvement, every correction designed to make her smaller, quieter, more acceptable, more marriageable, more willing to accept whatever scraps of affection and respect men like Edmund chose to offer. She wrote about the conservatory, about watching Edmund kiss Lydia, about the sickening understanding that her husband would see her as nothing more than a financial convenience and a domestic manager, about the engagement party where she had smiled and curtsied while dying inside, about Edmund's crude whispers and violent hands, and her mother's complicity in delivering her to such a man. She wrote about Frederick, about the first time he had touched her tears and seen what no one else had bothered to notice, about learning to sign, about feeling her laughter vibrate against his palm, about the deaf community in Bermondsey where children laughed without shame and expression was celebrated rather than punished, about the scream that had torn from her throat in that bright room, about feeling the vibration of stamping feet as deaf people applauded her release. She wrote about her rage, about the fury that had been building for 26 years beneath the pleasant surface her mother demanded, about how much she hated the woman who had given birth to her, and then spent decades crushing everything vital and alive out of her daughter, about how she wanted to burn this house down, wanted to destroy every symbol of her captivity, wanted to scream until her throat was raw and her voice was hoarse, and everyone in Mayfair could hear the pain that had been hidden for so long. The writing took perhaps 30 minutes, her hand cramping as words poured out faster than she could comfortably transcribe them, and when she finally set down the pen and read back what she had written, she felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified than she had ever been, because these words were the truth, the undeniable truth of her experience. And once acknowledged, they could not be unacknowledged. Once given form, they could not be forced back into formlessness. She closed the journal and stood, and as she did, her eyes fell on the window that overlooked the conservatory. Her mother's pride, the collection of exotic orchids that required such perfect conditions to surround, such constant vigilance and control, never allowed to simply exist without intervention. And Emmeline felt something click into place, some understanding of what she needed to do next, what physical act was required to complete this transformation from silent victim to woman who made sound without fear. She left the library and walked through the house toward the conservatory, and as she moved through the corridors, she felt her pace quickening, felt her breath coming faster, felt anticipation building in her chest like pressure before an explosion, and by the time she reached the conservatory door, she was nearly running, was desperate to reach those perfect controlled flowers and tear them apart with her bare hands. The conservatory was exactly as it had been the night of her engagement party. Glass walls fogged with moisture, exotic blooms arranged in precise rows, the sickly sweet scent of jasmine overwhelming, every surface clean and controlled, and maintained with obsessive care, and Emmeline looked at it all with hatred so pure it felt like clarity, felt like purpose, felt like the most honest emotion she had ever experienced. She started with the nearest orchid, a prize specimen her mother had purchased from an explorer recently returned from the Far East, had paid an obscene amount of money for this one plant, had displayed it prominently, and boasted about its rarity and beauty. And Emmeline picked up the ceramic pot and threw it against the glass wall with all her strength, the sound of shattering pottery and cracking glass so loud and shocking that she gasped. And then she laughed, actually laughed out loud at the destruction, at the chaos, at the beautiful, terrible mess. She moved through the conservatory like a storm, smashing pots, tearing petals from stems, ripping plants from their careful arrangements and throwing them on the floor, grinding delicate roots into the tile with her heels. And with each act of destruction she made sound. She shouted, she cried, she laughed, she screamed, every noise she had suppressed for 26 years pouring out in a cacophony that must have been audible throughout the entire house, probably throughout the entire square, and she did not care, did not try to quiet herself, did not apologize or diminish or make herself smaller. She was covered in soil and water, her nightclothes and dressing gown filthy and torn, her hair wild and loose around her shoulders, her hands bleeding from broken pottery and sharp stems, and she had never felt more alive, more present, more fully herself than in this moment of complete destruction, of chaos, of loud, messy, undeniable expression of everything she had been taught to hide. The conservatory door flew open, and Lady Catherine stood in the doorway, her face white with shock and horror, staring at the ruins of her prize collection, at her daughter standing in the center of the destruction like some wild thing, like a force of nature, like something that could not be controlled or contained or forced back into acceptable bounds. "What have you done?" Lady Catherine whispered, her voice strangled with rage and disbelief. "You have destroyed everything, years of cultivation, thousands of pounds, my entire collection. You ungrateful, spiteful, terrible girl." Emmeline turned to face her mother, and she felt no fear, felt no automatic flinching or cowering or scrambling to apologize, felt only a calm certainty that this destruction was necessary, was right, was the physical manifestation of her internal liberation. "These flowers were like me," she said, her voice loud and clear and steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Forced to survive in conditions too controlled, too perfect, never allowed to simply exist without constant intervention, you imported them from far away and made them perform beauty for your guests, made them symbols of your taste and refinement and wealth. And you did the same to me, imported me from childhood, and made me perform perfection, made me a symbol of your successful mothering, your proper daughter, your silent, obedient possession. Lady Catherine stepped into the conservatory, her shoes crunching on broken pottery. "You are hysterical," she said, attempting to reassert control. "You need more medicine. You need to rest. You do not know what you are saying." Emmeline laughed, a sound that bordered on manic, but felt gloriously free. "I know exactly what I am saying. I am saying that I am not your possession. I am not your redemption for whatever failures you believe you suffered in your own life. I am not your silence. I am not your carefully controlled orchid that exists only to make you look good. I am a person, a whole entire person with thoughts and feelings and desires and rage. So much rage that I have been swallowing for so long that it has poisoned me from the inside. But I am not swallowing it anymore. I am spitting it out. I am screaming it. I am destroying your perfect controlled symbols, and I am walking away." "You are ruined," Lady Catherine hissed, her composure finally cracking. "No one will receive you after this display. No respectable family will acknowledge you. You have thrown away everything I worked to build for you. And for what? For some deaf duke who can offer you nothing but social embarrassment and a life on the margins of society." Emmeline picked up one last orchid, a particularly beautiful specimen with delicate white petals, and she tore it apart slowly, deliberately, petal by petal, while maintaining eye contact with her mother. "I am finally free," she said quietly, each word weighted with meaning. "Your reception means nothing to me. Society's opinion means nothing to me. The only thing that matters is that I am claiming my own life, my own voice, my own right to exist loudly and messily and imperfectly. I choose Frederick because he sees me as I actually am and values me for it. But more importantly, I choose myself. I choose sound over silence. I choose expression over suppression. I choose life over the slow death you were forcing me toward." She dropped the torn petals and walked toward her mother, and Lady Catherine actually stepped back, actually flinched away from her daughter, as though Emmeline had become something dangerous, something unpredictable, something that could no longer be controlled through punishment and conditioning and carefully calibrated doses of laudanum. "You taught me to cry without sound because my pain inconvenienced you," Emmeline said, stopping directly in front of her mother, close enough to see the fear and fury warring in those cold eyes. "You taught me that my feelings were less important than your comfort, that my worth was measured by my ability to disappear, to take up no space, to cause no disturbance. But I will never be silent again. I will cry loudly, I will laugh loudly, I will exist loudly. And if that inconveniences you, if that disturbs your perfect controlled world, then you are welcome to look away, because I am done performing for an audience that never valued me anyway." She walked past her mother, leaving the older woman standing alone among the ruins of her conservatory, among the shattered symbols of control and cultivation and forced perfection. And Emmeline felt no guilt, felt no regret, felt only a lightness that came from having finally broken her own chains, rather than waiting for someone else to free her. She walked through the house, making no attempt to clean herself or hide the evidence of what she had done, walked past servants who stared with open shock at her disheveled appearance, and the trail of soil and water she left on the expensive carpets, walked directly back to the drawing room where Frederick and his allies had been waiting, and when she entered the room, covered in dirt and blood and torn flower petals, wild-haired and tear-stained and radiantly, terrifyingly alive, Frederick rose to his feet with an expression of wonder and pride and love so obvious that it made her chest ache. She crossed the room to him and signed, her hands moving with more confidence than they ever had before. "I have destroyed my mother's orchids. I have screamed and cried and laughed without controlling the volume. I have claimed my voice and my sound and my right to exist fully. And now I am ready to answer your question. Yes, I will marry you. But first, teach me to live loudly. Teach me everything you know about choosing freedom every day. Teach me how to be fully alive rather than merely surviving. Teach me what it means to express rather than suppress." Frederick's eyes were wet with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and he signed back, his movements expansive and joyful. "Tomorrow. We can be married tomorrow if you wish, or in a year, or never if you decide you would prefer to be free without attaching yourself to another man. But whatever you choose, I will teach you everything I know about living loudly, about celebrating expression, about refusing to shrink yourself to fit into spaces too small for human souls. I will introduce you to the deaf community, who will embrace you as one of their own. I will support whatever you want to become, whoever you want to be, and I will never, ever ask you to be silent." Emmeline turned to the Duke of Brandon and spoke aloud, her voice still rough and unfamiliar in her own ears, but present, real, undeniable. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to be married tomorrow. I have waited long enough to live. I have spent 26 years in a cage, and I do not want to waste another day. Please arrange whatever is necessary to make this happen as quickly as legally possible." The Duke of Brandon smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. "It will be my pleasure, Lady Emmeline. I will obtain a special license today. We can hold the ceremony tomorrow afternoon at my private chapel. Small and intimate. Witnesses only those you choose. No performance required, no society to please. Just two people choosing each other freely." Mrs. Morland approached and signed, her face alight with joy. "You have broken your chains. You have chosen freedom. You have become the woman you were always meant to be beneath all that imposed silence. Welcome to the community of the living. Welcome to the world of those who express fully and live loudly. We celebrate you. We honor your courage. We stamp our feet in approval of your transformation." Emmeline signed back, her movement still clumsy but improving. "Thank you for showing me another way to exist, for helping me understand that silence can be chosen rather than enforced, for applauding my scream when everyone else in my life would have punished it. I want to learn more. I want to become fluent in sign language. I want to be part of your community. I want to teach other hearing people that there are different ways to communicate, different ways to value each other beyond the words that come from mouths." Clara the maid had been standing near the doorway throughout this exchange, and now she stepped forward, her face wet with tears, and she curtsied deeply before speaking. "Miss Emmeline?" she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am so proud of you. I have watched you suffer for years, watched you cry silently in your room after enduring your mother's cruelty, watched you shrink and diminish yourself to fit into the role they demanded, and I have wished so many times that you would find the courage to fight back, to claim your own life. Seeing you now, covered in soil and wild and free, is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. I am honored to have played even a small part in helping you reach this moment." Emmeline crossed to her maid and pulled her into an embrace, something that would have been considered impossibly inappropriate just hours earlier, but now felt like the only possible response. "Thank you," she whispered into Clara's ear. "Thank you for smuggling my letter to Frederick. Thank you for the small kindnesses over the years. Thank you for being the only person in this house who ever looked at me with compassion rather than judgment. When I leave tomorrow, will you come with me? Will you join my household as my companion? Rather than my servant, I want people around me who choose to be there rather than people bound by duty or social obligation." Clara pulled back with shocked delight. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, I would be honored. I would love nothing more than to leave this house and start fresh somewhere new, with someone who values kindness and honesty over performance and control." Outside the drawing-room windows, the sky had darkened with the approach of a spring storm, thunder rumbling in the distance, and as Emmeline stood surrounded by these people who had helped her break free, who had offered her choice rather than chains, who celebrated her transformation rather than punishing her expression, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pelting against the glass with increasing intensity, and she felt as though the weather itself was responding to her emotional release, as though the universe was acknowledging the magnitude of what had just happened, the walls that had crumbled, the light that had flooded in. The woman who had died silently for 26 years and was now being born loudly into a future she would build herself. Frederick approached and took her hands again, and he spoke aloud, his voice unmodulated in the way of someone who cannot hear himself, but full of warmth and conviction. "I love you," he said, the words slightly slurred but perfectly understandable. "I love your intelligence and your passion and your courage and your determination to be fully alive. I love that you destroyed those orchids. I love that you screamed and cried and claimed your voice. I love who you are when you are not performing for an audience that does not deserve you. And I promise that I will spend every day for the rest of our lives helping you discover more of who you can be when you are free." Emmeline looked at him, this man who had seen her when no one else had bothered to look, who had valued her mind and her feelings and her authentic self, who had offered her choice rather than control, who had knelt before her and waited patiently while she broke her own chains. And she felt love blooming in her chest. Not the desperate attachment of someone seeking rescue, but the genuine affection of someone who had been truly seen and valued. And she spoke back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I love you too," she said. "I love that you do not see your deafness as a deficit, but as a difference. I love that you belong to a community that celebrates expression. I love that you have been patient while I learned to be free. I love that you offered me choice rather than simply taking me from one cage to another. And I promise that I will spend every day learning to live more loudly, more fully, more authentically, and I will never again apologize for taking up space in the world." The storm broke fully then, rain pouring down in sheets, thunder cracking overhead, lightning illuminating the drawing room in brilliant flashes. And through it all, Emmeline stood covered in soil and water and torn petals, holding Frederick's hands, surrounded by people who had chosen to help her rather than hurt her. And she laughed, loud and free and unrestrained, the sound of someone who had finally broken through the silence that had nearly killed her. Someone who had chosen freedom even when it was terrifying. Someone who had destroyed the symbols of her captivity and walked away from the cage, even though she did not yet fully know who she would become without it. And the sound of that laughter, loud and messy and perfectly imperfect, was the sound of a woman claiming her own life, her own voice, her own right to exist fully and loudly and without apology. And it was, she thought, the most beautiful sound she had ever made. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the East Wing Conservatory at Wentworth Hall, illuminating a scene so different from the one Emmeline had known in her mother's house that it might have belonged to another world entirely, another lifetime, another woman who bore only superficial resemblance to the silent, suppressed creature she had been just 3 months earlier. The conservatory here was not a shrine to controlled perfection, but a working studio. Tables covered with watercolor palettes and botanical specimens, easels holding half-finished paintings, and most importantly, children, 8 of them ranging in age from 7 to 14, all deaf, all bent over their work with expressions of fierce concentration, broken occasionally by laughter and animated signed conversations that filled the air with movement and life. Emmeline moved among them with easy grace, her hair pulled back in a simple style that would have horrified her mother, her dress practical rather than fashionable, covered with a paint-stained apron, and she laughed loudly and frequently, a sound that still sometimes surprised her with its volume and freedom, as she corrected a student's brush technique or praised particularly clever use of color, her hands flying through signs with increasing fluency, her face animated with the kind of unguarded expression that would once have earned her a sharp reprimand, but now earned her the children's trust and affection. She was demonstrating how to capture the translucent quality of a rose petal. When young Emma, a girl of 10 who had been born deaf to hearing parents who had largely given up trying to communicate with her, tugged on Emmeline's sleeve and signed a question about whether it was acceptable to make mistakes, whether perfection was required for the paintings to be valuable. Emmeline knelt beside the child's easel and signed back slowly, clearly, her expression earnest. "Your hands can say anything your heart feels," she signed, "and the same is true of your art. It does not need to be perfect to be valuable. It only needs to be honest, to show what you see and feel and think. Mistakes are part of learning, part of being human. Never let anyone silence you or make you feel that you must be perfect to deserve to take up space in the world. You are worthy exactly as you are, mistakes and all." The child's face lit with understanding and relief, and she returned to her painting with renewed confidence, and Emmeline felt a warmth in her chest that she had come to recognize as purpose, as meaning, as the satisfaction that came from using her knowledge and skills to help others rather than merely performing accomplishments to make herself marriageable. The school had been Frederick's idea, proposed on their wedding night when they had lain together in the peaceful darkness, his hand resting on her throat so he could feel her voice as she told him about her dreams for the future, about wanting to use her botanical knowledge for something more than personal satisfaction, and he had signed back with enthusiasm about establishing a school on the Wentworth estate where deaf children from London could come for extended visits, could learn not just academics, but practical skills like scientific illustration that might allow them to support themselves in a world that often refused to employ deaf workers. They had been married for 3 months now, and in that time, Emmeline had experienced more genuine happiness than in all her previous 26 years combined, had discovered what it meant to wake each morning without dread, to move through her days without the constant vigilance required to monitor and suppress every feeling, to go to sleep at night, beside someone who valued her authentic self rather than her ability to perform contentment. Their wedding had been nothing like the grand society affair her mother had been planning with Edmund, had been instead a small, intimate ceremony at the deaf church in Bermondsey, attended by perhaps 30 people, all of them either deaf themselves or closely connected to the deaf community, and the vows had been exchanged entirely in sign language, Frederick's hands moving with practiced fluency, and Emmeline's with determined effort, still learning but improving rapidly. And when they had sealed their promises with a kiss, the congregation had applauded not with polite clapping, but with vigorous foot-stamping that made the wooden floors vibrate, the deaf way of showing approval and joy. Lady Catherine had not attended, had in fact refused to acknowledge the marriage at all, had sent a cold letter through her solicitor formally severing all connection with her disobedient daughter, and Emmeline had read that letter with something between grief and relief, mourning the mother she had wished for but never had, while celebrating her freedom from the woman who had actually raised her. And she had burned the letter in the library fireplace, with Frederick's arm around her shoulders, had watched the paper curl and blacken and disappear, and had felt another chain breaking, another door closing on her old life. The Duke of Brandon had attended the wedding, had given Emmeline away in the absence of any family willing to perform that role, and Mrs. Beatrice Morland had stood beside her as witness, and Clara had wept happy tears throughout the ceremony, and afterward there had been a feast at the Bermondsey Asylum, where deaf and hearing people had celebrated together, signing and speaking and laughing and eating, and Emmeline had felt for the first time in her life that she belonged somewhere, that she was part of a community that valued her for who she actually was rather than who she could pretend to be. She was pulled from her memories by a touch on her shoulder, and she turned to find Frederick standing behind her, his expression warm with affection and quiet pride. And he signed, "The children are doing beautiful work. You are an excellent teacher. They trust you in a way they would never trust most hearing people, because they can see that you understand what it means to be silenced, to have your expression suppressed. You speak their language even though your deafness is metaphorical rather than literal." Emmeline signed back, "I am still learning. My signing is clumsy compared to yours or Beatrice's. But the children are patient with me. They seem to understand that I am trying, that I value their language and their community, that I am not attempting to fix them or make them more like hearing people, but rather to help them develop their own strengths and abilities." Frederick moved closer, his hand coming up to brush a streak of paint from her cheek, and he signed one-handed, his other hand still cupped against her face. "You have become fluent in more than sign language. You have become fluent in the language of freedom, of expression, of living loudly without apology, watching you with these children, seeing you laugh and gesture and take up space without shrinking yourself, is the greatest joy of my life. You are exactly who I hoped you would become when I first saw you crying silently in the library. Except you are even more than I imagined, more vibrant, more alive, more fully yourself." She felt tears gathering in her eyes, the happy kind, the kind that came from overwhelming gratitude and love rather than pain or grief. And she signed back, "You gave me the gift of seeing myself differently, of understanding that my silence was not serenity, but suppression, of learning that there were other ways to exist in the world. I will spend the rest of my life grateful for that gift, for you, for this life we are building together." The children had finished their paintings and were cleaning their brushes, signing to each other about which pieces they wanted to work on next session, and Emmeline moved among them, offering praise and gentle corrections, reminding them to care for their materials properly. And when the lesson ended and the children filed out with their caretakers, heading toward the dining room for lunch, Frederick and Emmeline were left alone in the sun-filled conservatory, surrounded by the evidence of creative expression and learning, and she turned to him with a smile that felt like it might split her face, so wide and genuine and unguarded. He pulled her close, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, her head resting against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she thought about how much of their communication happened without words or signs, happened through touch and presence, and the kind of attention that came from truly seeing each other, truly valuing each other, truly choosing each other every day. That evening, in their private quarters on the second floor of Wentworth Hall, Emmeline sat at her writing desk finishing correspondence, while Frederick reviewed architectural plans for the expansion of the school. They hoped to add a dedicated science laboratory and an additional dormitory wing that would allow them to accommodate more students, and the comfortable domesticity of the scene filled her with contentment. This was what marriage could be, she had learned. This partnership of equals working toward shared goals, this mutual support and respect, this freedom to be fully oneself without performance or pretense. Frederick looked up from his plans and studied her face with that intense attention he always showed, reading something in her expression, and he rose and crossed to her desk. Signing, "What are you thinking about? You look happy but also contemplative. Tell me what is in your heart." Emmeline set down her pen and turned to face him fully, and as she did, tears began streaming down her face, and Frederick's expression immediately shifted to concern, his hands moving to cup her face, feeling the moisture there, signing anxiously, "What is wrong? What has happened? Why are you crying?" She laughed through her tears and signed back, "These are happy tears. I am crying because I am happy, because I am sitting here in our home doing work that matters, surrounded by evidence of the life we are building, and I am overwhelmed with gratitude, with love, with the sheer impossibility of having gone from that silent, dying woman in my mother's house to this person who laughs loudly and teaches children and lives without fear. It seems impossible that this is my life now, and yet it is, and I am crying because happiness can be as overwhelming as grief, can fill you just as completely, can demand expression just as urgently." Frederick's face softened with understanding, and he signed, his movements gentle and tender, "I feel every one of your tears. Tell me everything. Share with me all the happiness and gratitude and overwhelming feeling. I want to know every thought in your beautiful mind, every emotion in your fierce heart." They moved to the small sofa near the fireplace, settling together with the ease of people who had learned each other's bodies, each other's rhythms, each other's needs, and Emmeline began signing, telling him about her day, about the children's progress, about young Emma's question about perfection, about the way teaching allowed her to process her own experiences and transform them into something helpful for others who had been silenced in different ways. And Frederick watched her hands with complete attention, occasionally signing questions or comments, and the conversation flowed between them like water, natural and necessary and beautiful. She paused, her hands stilling for a moment, and then she signed something she had been waiting for the right moment to share. "There is something else, something I learned today that adds to my overwhelming happiness. I visited the doctor in the village this morning while you were meeting with the architect, and he confirmed what I suspected. I am pregnant. We are going to have a child." Frederick's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: surprise, joy, wonder, slight fear, and then overwhelming happiness, and he pulled her into an embrace so tight she could barely breathe. And when he pulled back, his hands were shaking as he signed, "A child. We are going to be parents. This is, I do not even have words, signed or spoken, to express what I feel. This is everything. This is the future continuing. This is our love made physical. This is terrifying and wonderful and perfect." Emmeline signed back, smiling through fresh tears. "I am terrified too. I do not know how to be a mother. I only know how not to be one. I only know what my mother did wrong and what damage it caused, but I want to try. I want to raise our child to express freely, to make sound without fear, to understand that they are valuable exactly as they are, whether they can hear or not, whether they are perfect or not, whether they please society or not. I want to give them the childhood I never had, the freedom to be fully themselves." Frederick's response was immediate and emphatic. "We will give them that childhood together. We will teach them sign language and spoken language. We will teach them that there are many ways to communicate, and none is superior to the others. We will teach them that disability is not tragedy, but simply difference. We will teach them to value expression over suppression, community over isolation, authentic connection over social performance, and most importantly, we will teach them that they are loved unconditionally, not for what they accomplish or how well they behave, but simply for existing, for being themselves, for being ours. They sat together, planning the future, discussing whether they would hire a deaf nurse or a hearing one or both, debating whether they should expand the school before the baby came or wait until after, wondering whether the child would be deaf or hearing and agreeing that they would love and support them either way. And through it all, Emmeline felt a peace she had never imagined possible, a sense that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside her. Frederick signed. "You have taught me something profound, something I did not fully understand before I met you. You have taught me that feeling is louder than sound, that the deepest communication happens not through ears, but through attention, through presence, through the willingness to truly see another person and value what you find there. I have been deaf since I was 14, and I thought I understood silence. But you taught me that there are different kinds of silence. The silence I live in is chosen, is peaceful, is full of meaning communicated through hands and faces and bodies. But the silence you lived in was enforced, was violent, was a prison that nearly killed you, and learning the difference has made me appreciate my deafness in new ways, has made me grateful for the deaf community that taught me I was not broken, but simply different, has made me want to ensure that no one else has to experience the kind of silencing you endured." Emmeline felt fresh tears streaming down her face, and she signed back, her movements expansive and passionate. "You have taught me equally profound things. You have taught me that rescue is not about being saved by someone else, but about being given the tools and support to save yourself. You offered me choice rather than control. You showed me another world, but you made me walk into it myself. You did not carry me across the threshold of freedom. You held the door open and waited while I gathered the courage to step through, and that made all the difference, because it meant that my freedom was something I claimed rather than something that was given to me. And claimed freedom is so much more powerful than granted freedom. It cannot be taken away as easily because it comes from inside rather than being imposed from outside." They talked long into the night, signing in the firelight, occasionally speaking aloud to feel the vibrations of voice and laughter, touching frequently, maintaining the constant physical contact that had become natural to them, necessary to them, part of how they expressed love and connection and partnership. And when they finally went to bed, they lay together in the darkness, Frederick's hand resting on Emmeline's still flat stomach, feeling for the life growing there even though it was far too early for movement. And Emmeline placed her hand over his, and she spoke aloud into the darkness, knowing he could not hear her, but needing to say it anyway, needing to give voice to the gratitude and love that filled her so completely. "I learned to cry without making sound," she said softly, her voice no longer afraid of volume, but choosing quiet in this intimate moment. "I learned that silence could be survival, that suppressing myself was the price of being allowed to exist. And then I met you, and I learned that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, that there was a whole community of people who lived in silence by necessity, but expressed themselves more fully than most, hearing people ever do. And then I learned that love hears what sound cannot carry, that the deepest communication happens through attention and presence and the willingness to truly see each other. And now I am teaching children what you taught me, That expression is a right, not a privilege, that silence is only oppressive when it is forced, that there are 1,000 ways to communicate, and none of them require making yourself small or quiet or acceptable to people who do not value you anyway. She felt Frederick's hand tighten on her stomach, felt him shift closer, felt his lips press against her temple. And though he could not hear her words, she knew he understood her meaning, knew he felt her love and gratitude and overwhelming happiness through the language of touch, through the vibration of her voice against his skin, through the peaceful silence they had chosen together, a silence that was not empty but full, not enforced but freely given, not a prison but a sanctuary. And in that silence, Emmeline finally, fully understood what Frederick had been trying to teach her from that first morning in the library, that being heard had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved for exactly who you were beneath all the performance and pretense. And she had been heard, had been seen, had been loved. And in return, she had learned to hear not with ears but with heart, to see not just surfaces but depths, to love not the performance but the person. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the greatest transformation of all, not learning to make sound, but learning to value what sound could never fully express, the profound connection between two people who had learned each other's language, who had chosen each other freely, who had built together a life based not on silence or sound, but on the kind of communication that transcended both, the language of genuine attention, of authentic presence, of unconditional love. And it was, she knew, the most beautiful language she would ever learn. The Royal Exhibition Hall in Kensington blazed with afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall arched windows, illuminating the botanical artwork that lined the walls in gilded frames, and Emmeline stood in the entrance with her husband beside her and her infant daughter cradled in her arms, taking in the glittering crowd of society's finest, who had come to view the unprecedented collection of scientific illustrations by British artists, including, for the first time in the exhibition's history, work by a married woman whose name appeared in full beneath her paintings rather than hidden behind the anonymity of her husband's title. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk that brought out the color in her eyes, a shade her mother would have declared too bold, too attention-seeking, too inappropriate for a lady who should blend into the background like a watercolor wash. But Emmeline had chosen it, deliberately, had stood before the mirror in her dressing room that morning and smiled at her own reflection, at this woman who wore vibrant colors and laughed openly and signed with her hands even while speaking, and made no effort whatsoever to diminish herself, to make others comfortable. 18 months had passed since the morning she had destroyed her mother's conservatory and walked out of the Dashwood townhouse covered in soil and torn petals, 18 months since she had married Frederick in the Duke of Brandon's private chapel with only a handful of witnesses present, 18 months since she had begun the slow, difficult, exhilarating work of learning to live loudly, to express fully, to exist without apology or shame or the constant fear that making sound would result in punishment. Those months had been spent primarily at Frederick's country estate in Kent, far from London's prying eyes and endless social obligations, in a household that operated by different rules than the ones Emmeline had grown up with, where servants were treated with respect rather than invisible obedience, where the deaf members of the staff communicated freely in sign language, where expression was celebrated and authenticity valued above performance, where Emmeline had slowly, gradually learned to trust that she would not be punished for taking up space, for having opinions, for crying loudly when she needed to cry, and laughing loudly when she needed to laugh, and sometimes just sitting in chosen silence that was peaceful rather than enforced. She had spent those months working on her botanical illustrations with a focus and dedication that would have been impossible in her mother's house, had expanded beyond orchids to document the wild flowers and herbs and trees of the Kent countryside, had developed a style that combined scientific accuracy with artistic beauty in ways that caught the attention of the Royal Botanical Society. When Frederick, proud of his wife's talent, had submitted a portfolio of her work without telling her, and the letter inviting her to display at the exhibition had made her cry, had made her scream with joy, had made her dance around their morning room while Frederick watched with delight, and their 3-month-old daughter, named Beatrice in honor of Mrs. Morland, who had become a dear friend and frequent visitor, gurgled happily from her cradle. The invitation to exhibit had also meant returning to London, facing the society that had once defined her worth entirely by her marriageability and her ability to perform acceptable femininity, facing her mother, who had not spoken to her since the wedding, who had attended the ceremony with a face like carved stone and left immediately afterward without offering congratulations or acknowledgement, who had apparently spent the intervening months telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had been seduced and manipulated by a disabled man who preyed on vulnerable young women, and Emmeline had been terrified of this return, had lain awake nights worrying that seeing her mother again would undo all her progress, would send her spiraling back into silence and submission. But Frederick had held her and reminded her that she was not the same woman who had left London, that she had spent 18 months practicing freedom, that she could choose to leave at any moment if the experience became too much, and his confidence in her had given her the courage to accept the invitation, to prepare her work for display, to pack her vibrant dresses and her sleeping daughter, and return to face the world that had nearly destroyed her. Now, standing in the exhibition hall surrounded by the cream of London society, Emmeline felt remarkably calm, felt grounded in her body in a way she never had before, felt Frederick's steady presence beside her like an anchor, felt baby Beatrice's warm weight in her arms like a reminder of the future she had built rather than the past she had escaped. And she moved forward into the crowd with her head high and a genuine smile on her face that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with authentic pleasure at seeing her work displayed so beautifully, so publicly, so proudly under her own name. The reaction to her arrival rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, people turning to stare at the Duchess of Wentworth, who had caused such scandal 18 months ago by breaking her engagement mere days before the wedding, by marrying instead a deaf duke, by disappearing to the country and refusing all social invitations, by living entirely outside the bounds of acceptable society. And the whispers started immediately, the sort of vicious gossip that would have destroyed Emmeline once upon a time, but now merely amused her. She could see the matrons leaning together and speculating about whether the child was truly the Duke's, or perhaps conceived before the wedding. Could see the young ladies eyeing her dress with envy and disapproval in equal measure, could see the gentlemen assessing her with the sort of calculation that suggested they were wondering if a woman who had defied convention once might be persuaded to do so again in ways that would benefit them. Frederick could not hear the whispers, but he could read the room's energy through visual cues, through the way people shifted and stared and leaned toward each other, and he signed to Emmeline with a wry smile. "They are talking about us. Should we give them something more interesting to discuss? Perhaps I could kiss you scandalously in the middle of the exhibition hall." Emmeline laughed aloud, a sound that turned more heads, and she signed back while speaking, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "I think my botanical illustrations are scandal enough for one day, but I appreciate the offer. Perhaps we can save the scandalous kissing for later, when we have fewer witnesses." The sight of the Duchess both speaking and signing simultaneously seemed to confuse many observers, who clearly did not understand why she would bother with hand movements when her husband could simply read her lips. But Emmeline had learned over the past months that signing while speaking helped her feel more fully expressed, helped her engage her whole body in communication rather than just her voice, helped her stay grounded and present rather than retreating into the old patterns of disconnection and performance. She moved toward the wall where her work was displayed, and as she approached, she felt her breath catch at the sight of her paintings mounted in elegant frames. The botanical illustrations she had created in stolen hours and hidden away from her mother's disapproval, now displayed for all of London to see, each one labelled with a brass plaque that read, Lady Emmeline Wentworth, Duchess of Wentworth, and seeing her name there, her own name rather than merely her husband's title, her identity claimed publicly rather than subsumed into marriage, made tears spring to her eyes, the happy kind of tears that she had learned to distinguish from the pain kind, the release kind, the rage kind, all the different emotional expressions that she had once compressed into silent weeping, but now could identify and honor as distinct experiences. A society matron approached, Lady Pemberton, who had been at Emmeline's disastrous engagement party 18 months ago, who had mistaken her silent tears for joy, and the older woman's expression was a complicated mixture of pity and curiosity, and barely concealed judgment. Duchess, she said, her tone suggesting she was doing Emmeline a great favor by acknowledging her at all. What a surprise to see you returned to London, and with an infant no less. Such courage you must have, managing a household and a child with a deaf husband. I confess I do not know how you cope. It must be terribly difficult communicating with someone so afflicted. You are to be commended for your patience and sacrifice. Emmeline felt Frederick tense slightly beside her, felt his hand on her waist tighten, and she knew he had read enough of Lady Pemberton's lips to understand the condescension in her words, the pity that positioned him as burden rather than partner, and she felt a flash of protective fury on his behalf, on behalf of the deaf community that had welcomed her so warmly, on behalf of everyone who had ever been told their way of existing was lesser simply because it was different. She shifted Beatrice in her arms and met Lady Pemberton's eyes steadily, her voice clear and firm and entirely without the apologetic tone that would have colored it 18 months ago. Such blessing I have, she said, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. My husband hears me better than any hearing man ever has. He feels every tear on my face and every joy in my heart. He sees me completely and values what he sees. He has taught me that sound is not the only language of love, that being heard has nothing to do with noise and everything to do with being truly seen. I have never been happier, never been more fully myself, never been more grateful for the life I have built, and I would not trade it for anything. Lady Pemberton looked taken aback by this passionate defense, clearly expecting Emmeline to demur or make self-deprecating remarks about managing as best she could, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Emmeline had already turned away, had dismissed the conversation as finished, had chosen to spend her attention on her artwork rather than on someone whose judgment meant nothing to her, and the power of that choice, the freedom of simply walking away from a conversation that did not serve her, made her feel strong in a way that would have been impossible before Frederick taught her that she could choose where to direct her energy, that she was not obligated to engage with everyone who demanded her attention. Frederick had watched the entire exchange, and now he signed to her with pride evident in his expression. You were magnificent. You did not apologize. You did not diminish yourself. You stood firm in your truth. I am so proud of the woman you have become, the woman you were always meant to be beneath all that imposed silence. Emmeline signed back, one-handed since Beatrice occupied the other arm. I learned from the best. You taught me that I do not owe anyone my performance, that I can simply be authentic and let them be uncomfortable with it if they choose. It is remarkably freeing to stop trying to manage other people's feelings about my existence. They moved along the wall, examining her illustrations, and Emmeline found herself surrounded by admirers who appreciated her work for its scientific accuracy and artistic merit, botanists and artists and scholars who asked intelligent questions about her techniques and her subjects, who treated her as a serious artist rather than a dabbling aristocrat, and she engaged with them enthusiastically, speaking and signing simultaneously, her whole body involved in the communication, and she felt more alive, more present, more genuinely connected to these strangers who valued her work than she had ever felt in years of stilted social conversation in her mother's drawing room. Across the room, she caught sight of her mother standing alone near the entrance, Lady Catherine dressed in her usual severe style, her face carefully composed into an expression of polite interest that did not quite hide the bitterness beneath. And Emmeline felt a complex swirl of emotions, pity and anger and grief and relief all mixed together, because her mother looked diminished somehow, looked smaller and older and lonelier than Emmeline remembered. And she understood with sudden clarity that Lady Catherine's cruelty had come from her own cage, from her own silenced suffering, from her own inability to imagine freedom. And while this understanding did not excuse what her mother had done, did not erase the years of abuse and control, it did allow Emmeline to feel something other than pure rage when she looked at the woman who had given birth to her and then spent decades trying to crush everything vital out of her. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Lady Catherine's expression flickered, something vulnerable showing through the careful mask, for just a moment before being ruthlessly suppressed. And Emmeline saw in that flicker the echo of her own old pain, the learned silence, the swallowed feelings, the performance of contentment while dying inside. And she felt a wave of pity for her mother, for this woman who had never learned to break her own chains, who had transferred her suffering onto her daughter rather than fighting for freedom, who would die in the cage she had built for herself because she lacked the courage or the support or the imagination to envision anything different. But pity did not mean obligation, did not mean reconciliation, did not mean allowing her mother back into her life to potentially harm her or her daughter or the peace she had worked so hard to build. And Emmeline held her mother's gaze for a long moment, acknowledged the pain they shared, acknowledged the cycle of trauma that Lady Catherine had perpetuated, and then she deliberately turned away, chose to focus on the people who celebrated her rather than the person who had spent years trying to destroy her. And in that turning away, she felt the final thread of her mother's control snap, felt herself fully free in a way she had not quite achieved until this moment of choosing to walk away. Not in fear or anger, but in calm recognition that some relationships are too poisonous to maintain, that she had no obligation to set herself on fire to keep her mother warm. She moved deeper into the exhibition hall, and as she turned a corner, she came face to face with Edmund Whitmore, Viscount Whitmore, who stood before one of her paintings looking wan and tired, and significantly older than his 34 years. And beside him stood Lydia, no longer golden and glowing but pinched and bitter, wearing a dress that had been expensive once but now showed signs of wear, and the couple looked at each other with the sort of mutual resentment that spoke of years of disappointment compressed into 18 short months. Edmund's eyes widened when he saw Emmeline, and something like longing flashed across his face, not for her specifically, but for what she represented, for the money he had lost when the engagement was broken, for the comfortable future that had evaporated when his debts became public knowledge, and his reputation was ruined by Frederick's carefully deployed evidence of fraud and infidelity. "Emmeline," he said, attempting to infuse his voice with warmth that rang completely false. "You look well. Marriage clearly agrees with you. I had hoped we might have a moment to speak, to perhaps clear the air between us. We were friends once. Before everything became so complicated." Emmeline looked at him, at this man who had kissed her cousin in the garden while engaged to her, who had struck her face and whispered crude threats about their wedding night, who had seen her as nothing more than a financial convenience and a body to use as he pleased, and she felt nothing. No anger, no pain, no fear, no curiosity about what he might want to say, only a mild detachment, as though looking at a stranger who had no connection to her life whatsoever. She shifted Beatrice in her arms, the weight of her daughter grounding her, reminding her of everything she had built in the space where Edmund's cruelty might have destroyed her if she had not found the courage to escape, and she spoke with perfect calm and absolute finality. "I am well, Lord Whitmore. I wish you good day." The dismissal was complete, was delivered without emotion or elaboration, without any opening for further conversation, and she walked past him without waiting for a response, moved past Lydia, who watched with obvious envy, and she did not look back, did not wonder what they thought or felt or wanted, did not spare them another thought beyond a vague sense of relief that she had escaped the future they represented, the slow death of silent suffering in a marriage based on lies and financial necessity and mutual contempt. Frederick caught up to her near the center of the exhibition hall, where a large canvas displayed her most ambitious work, a detailed illustration of an ancient oak tree, with every leaf and branch and root rendered in exquisite detail. And he signed, "I saw you speak with your former betrothed. Are you well? Did he upset you?" Emmeline signed back with a genuine smile, "I am perfectly well. He is nothing to me now, less than nothing. A stranger whose path I once nearly followed to my own destruction. I feel no anger toward him, only gratitude that I escaped, only relief that my life is nothing like what it would have been if I had married him, only joy that I chose you instead, chose freedom instead, chose life instead of slow death." Frederick pulled her close, mindful of Beatrice between them, and he kissed her forehead, a gesture of tenderness and respect and deep abiding love. And around them, the society matrons gasped and whispered about such public displays of affection, about how the deaf duke had no sense of proper behavior, about how the duchess should be mortified by such attention. But Emmeline only laughed, only leaned into her husband's embrace, only felt grateful for a man who showed his love openly, rather than hiding it behind propriety and performance. They stood together before her artwork, and Frederick signed, "Are you happy we came? Are you glad you returned to London? Was it too difficult facing your past?" Emmeline looked around the exhibition hall, at the glittering crowd that had once defined her entire world, at the people who still lived in cages of propriety and performance, who still measured their worth by society's approval, who still swallowed their feelings and maintained pleasant expressions while dying slowly inside. And she understood that she had needed this return, had needed to see that she was free while they remained imprisoned, had needed to prove to herself that her transformation was real and lasting, that she could face her past without being pulled back into it, that she had built a life that was genuinely better than anything this world could have offered her if she had stayed silent and obedient and trapped. "Yes," she signed back to Frederick, her movements expansive and confident. "I am happy we came. I needed to see that I am free, that they are all still in cages they built themselves. I needed to stand in this room as myself, fully myself, loud and colorful and unashamed, and feel no fear, no desire to shrink, no impulse to apologize for existing. I needed this closure, this proof that I have truly escaped, that I am living rather than merely surviving." Baby Beatrice stirred in her arms and made a small sound, and Emmeline looked down at her daughter, at this tiny person who would grow up in a household where expression was celebrated, where crying was allowed, where making sound was encouraged rather than punished, where she would learn sign language alongside spoken English, where she would see her father's deafness not as disability, but as difference, where she would be taught that being heard had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with being truly seen. And Emmeline felt such overwhelming love and gratitude for this child, for this future that looked nothing like her own past, for the chance to break the cycle of trauma and control, to raise a daughter who would never have to learn to cry without making sound. The afternoon sun shifted, streaming through the tall windows at a new angle, illuminating Emmeline's botanical illustrations with golden light, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the conservatory where she had witnessed Edmund's betrayal to the library, where Frederick had first noticed her silent tears, from the bright room in Bermondsey where she had screamed for the first time, to the destroyed orchids that had symbolized her breaking chains, from the small private chapel where she had married Frederick, to the country estate where she had slowly learned to live loudly, and finally, to this moment, standing in the Royal Exhibition Hall with her husband beside her and her daughter in her arms, and her artwork displayed under her own name, proof that she had not only survived, but thrived, that she had transformed from silent victim to empowered woman, that she had claimed her voice and her life and her right to exist fully and without apology. She thought about the title that had defined her journey, about learning to cry without making sound because silence was survival, about the years of swallowing her feelings to avoid punishment, about the training that had taught her to die quietly so as not to inconvenience anyone with her pain. And she thought about Frederick, about the deaf Duke who could not hear her tears, but who felt every single one on her face, who had taught her that being heard was about being seen, about being valued, about being loved for her authentic self rather than her ability to perform contentment. And she understood that the real miracle of their relationship was not that he had rescued her, though he had helped her escape, but that he had taught her to rescue herself, had shown her that she had always had the power to choose freedom, had simply needed someone to believe in her enough that she could begin to believe in herself. As the afternoon wore on, as more admirers approached to discuss her work, as Frederick translated for deaf visitors who appreciated her art and her fluent signing, as baby Beatrice slept peacefully in her arms, Emmeline felt a deep sense of completion, of having come full circle, of having returned to the world that had nearly destroyed her, and discovering that it no longer had any power over her, that she had built something stronger and truer and more beautiful than anything this glittering society could offer, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never again cry without making sound unless she chose to, that she would never again silence herself to make others comfortable, that she would never again accept a cage when she could choose freedom, because she had learned, finally and completely, that being heard had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with being seen, and she was seen, deeply and truly seen, by her husband and her chosen community, and most importantly by herself. And in being seen, she had been heard in ways that transcended noise, had been valued in ways that transformed her life, had been loved in ways that made her whole. The exhibition would continue for weeks. Her artwork would be discussed and admired, and eventually purchased by the Royal Botanical Society for their permanent collection. Her name would become known in scientific and artistic circles as a serious illustrator rather than a dabbling aristocrat, and she would continue to work, to create, to document the natural world with precision and passion. But in this moment, standing in the golden afternoon light with Frederick beside her and Beatrice in her arms, Emmeline felt only gratitude, only joy, only the deep, bone-certain knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, living exactly the life she was meant to live, loving and being loved in return, free and loud and unashamed, and the tears that fell now were happy ones, were tears of relief and triumph and overwhelming emotion. and she made no attempt to hide them, made no attempt to cry without sound, because she had finally learned, after 26 years of silence and 18 months of freedom, that her tears were valid, that her feelings mattered, that her voice deserved to be heard, whether through sound or sign or art, or simply the authentic expression of her genuine self. And she was heard, she was seen, she was free, she was loved. And that, she thought, as Frederick wiped a tear from her cheek and smiled at her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. That was everything. That was the whole world. That was the life she had chosen and fought for and built from the ruins of the cage she had destroyed. And it was beautiful, and it was hers, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever needed and more than she had ever dared to dream possible. And she would spend the rest of her life honoring that gift, protecting that freedom, and teaching her daughter and anyone else who would listen that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, that being heard transcended sound, and that the most important voice to honor was the one that lived inside your own heart, the one that knew your truth, the one that deserved to be expressed fully and loudly and without apology, no matter what the world might say, no matter who might be uncomfortable, no matter how much easier it might seem to return to the cage and die quietly rather than live loudly and risk everything for the chance to be authentically, completely, gloriously free.